Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makwidi. The time is 8 minutes before the top of the hour, and we're going to be switching gears now to a very, very important conversation. The 10th of December is celebrated as International Human Rights Day. It's the day that marks the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and a moment to reflect on global accountability, justice, and the unfinished work of confronting, in South Africa's case, apartheid era crimes. But this year, the observance comes with renewed urgency. International human rights lawyer Wendy Isaack argues that the world is once again failing victims of apartheid, both past and present. In her latest op ed, she warns that the international community has left massive gaps in justice for survivors of South Africa's apartheid regime, while simultaneously allowing Israel's apartheid and genocide against Palestinians to continue with impunity. So, as the United Nations prepares to finalize the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty, Isaacs says the world is at a decisive moment, and whether to codify apartheid clearly, truthfully, and inclusively, or maybe risk repeating the historic failures of the TRC, where millions of victims were never recognized. And she's joining us via a virtual platform to help us understand what is at stake here, both legally, morally, and politically, with the Isaac Senior Gender, Justice, and International Law Fellow, and also a leading voice in the global struggle for accountability. Welcome to News and Views. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be in conversation with you. I appreciate it.
No, pleasure's all ours. I think we'll jump right into it. Your piece that you wrote, your op-ed, I think highlights the painful symmetry between South Africa's apartheid past and also Israel's apartheid system today, something that we've always spoken about, the parallels between the two. Why was it so important to revisit these parallels on International Human Rights Day?
Look, I mean, I think 1948, and when you started this conversation, you zoned right in on it, right? The adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 came alongside two things, and these two things happened in South Africa and in the Palestinian context. In the South African context, where the National Party introduced quite swiftly its brutal system of apartheid and the legacies of which we're dealing with till today as primarily the Black community in this country. And I'm going to get back to where the gaps and the failures were in our own system. At the same time, in 1948, with the establishment of the State of Israel, and I'm going to be precise, the Nakba that happened that unfolded in Palestine, and the continuation of the Nakba that we see till today with the genocide unfolding and continuing genocide in Gaza, that came along with the introduction of the apartheid regime in that state, or in that context at the same time. So we had three things happening in 1948. And so this is why this matters. The thing, I want to mention a specific thing, and this struck me as quite remarkable when my first trip that I took to Palestine, it was 2012. And I learned there that in 1950, the Israeli authorities introduced what they called the absentee property law.
Mm-hmm.
And literally, this was the law that was designed to take over property and land from Palestinians who had fled the Nakba in 48. Internally displaced Palestinians inside of the State of Israel. This law is still in place. And the quite remarkable thing about this law is that for the purposes of property, the Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons were considered absent for the purposes of property, so that the state could take over their homes and their land. But for the purposes of kind of claiming refugee status, or from UNRWA, or even citizenship of the Israeli state, they considered present. Now, can you imagine the kind of confusion that creates? So what we're asking for today is, this is a critical moment. There are conversations happening at the UN level. We have the ongoing genocide in Gaza. We have an apartheid system that's been implemented across the territory by the Israeli authorities since 48, and more so in the 1967 occupied territories for decades. So we have an opportunity to say, if there's a conversation about what apartheid is and what it means, let's look at where do we have shortcomings as a country. You may have heard of the work that's being done by the Foundation for Human Rights, the unfinished business of the TRC, the COSAS 4 case, the CRADOC 4 cases, and the Campepe Commission that's been established by our own government to look at why were there no investigations and prosecutions for people who did not apply, for security for officials who did not apply for amnesty during our own TRC, and how many millions of South Africans were left out of a victim recognition gap because we didn't prosecute apartheid in this country. This is the fundamental point. Not a single person in the world, and not in South Africa and not in Namibia, has ever been prosecuted for the crime of apartheid. While apartheid was declared a crime in 1976.
And I think that's very, very
Now,
important. Very, very important. And sorry to jump in there because I have a question that's coming to me as you're speaking about the TRC and its incomplete legacy. You point out that the TRC also recognize only a narrow category of victims and left out millions and millions that have been affected by forced removals, by land disposition, and racialized poverty. Essentially, what are the consequences of this partial truth for South Africa today, in this day and age?
I mean, obviously, it boils down to the failure to classify the system of apartheid itself as a crime means that redress and reparations for victims is incomplete, right? So if you are only looking at a small category, and I think the number, if I'm correct, is about the 22,000 individuals were found to be victims of apartheid. Only 22,000,
Wow.
because of the narrow definition of what was considered criminal under the apartheid system. Okay, that's where the failure lies, and that's why we're now saying, okay, if we look at the millions of South Africans, land dispossession, again, similar to Palestine, arbitrary executions, arbitrary arrests that were conducted, what has been the impact of families? Where are on families and survivors of those victims who were persecuted? And what does it mean? Take, for instance, someone who did not appear, or family members, and I'm going to be very personal in this moment, right? I was born in 1977, so I grew up under the system of apartheid. My own parents were displaced by the apartheid system and apartheid government in KZN in the 60s. The redress for those families who did not appear before the TRC, what does that look like? Where's the reparations conversation in South Africa sitting? There's a question of what has happened with the reparations funds that are supposed to go to victims. Then there's a question of what has happened to the individual criminals in the security forces who claim that they should not be prosecuted for the crime of apartheid. I'm going to put this on the table for your listeners. There's a case, the COSAS 4 case that is being led by the Foundation for Human Rights is going to go back to court next year. In March next year. And this case is going to be the most significant case in looking at what does it look like for individual forces or members of police forces from the 70s and 80s who committed crimes of murder, kidnapping, and killed apartheid activists. What should accountability look like for them? We have an important role to play here as South Africans, okay? And I want to be really clear on this point. The struggle for apartheid was fought by South Africans, the people died for it, but there's also an element of international solidarity, right?
Yeah.
That led to the demise of the apartheid system. We have an opportunity to say, okay, what does international solidarity look like when we think of apartheid being implemented in another country? In a very similar fashion to the way that it was done here, only much worse if we look at the details of it closely. So this is a call to say there are global North states, global North organizations, and many others who are talking about, okay, let's define apartheid. What is the definition? We're saying as Black South African women, don't leave out the gender. You left out gender in the TRC. Don't leave it out again now. But what does it look like to look at the gender dimensions of the apartheid system? We need to make a contribution. What happened to Black women in this country? because of the system of apartheid. What is happening to Palestinian women because of the system of apartheid there and the genocide? Let's zone in on the gender conversation.
Very, very important. I think that's one that goes largely ignored. The fact that, Black South African women, in essence, had almost a double conundrum, having to deal with the apartheid regime as people of color first, and secondly, as women. Very, very significant point that you're raising. I want to come back to the Xhosa's 4 case that you mentioned that is heading to trial. You said it's the first ever prosecution of apartheid as a crime. How significant is that moment, and could it set precedents for other cases to emerge after that?
I think it is the most significant case, and I'm going to give you a heads up to say it would be a great thing to speak to the attorneys at FHR who are leading on this. The fact that there's no jurisprudence on the crime of apartheid anywhere in the world, right, means that even in considering what the definition of apartheid is, we're relying on international legal framings that may or may not be adequate. So this is why we're looking at the definition. In the absence of a clear case that sets out what is the crime of apartheid, this is what the court has said, this is the crime that's been committed, and we can work with that, we are left with a definition that is based on understandings of race and crimes based on race that were formulated in the 1970s. And that's where we come in as Marjorie. We're saying, okay, let's look at how that formulation, it didn't make sense then because it looked at race as a biological construct. But there's been so much developments in the international human rights framework to say race is a social construct. How do we understand race in a way that captures a lot more victims, so that it's not just about how you are defined biologically as whether black or white or not, But when you say biological construct, we're asking ourselves, and in international criminal law, we're trying to get at what is the perpetrator thinking when they commit this crime against you. And I want to say this very clearly, and I don't want to create any confusion. In the framework of international human rights law, race is understood as a social construct. That's why in international human rights law, there's absolute clarity about apartheid violations in South Africa, in Namibia, and in Palestine. No confusion there. In international criminal law, the standards that are used to judge for criminality, accountability, etc., are different. And the objective standard that is used to look at what race is may put certain people outside.
Oh man, we seem to have lost Wendy Isaack there. I think we're going to go for a quick break. We'll try and get her back, and then we'll see where we wrap up that conversation, because it's a very, very important one, and one that we need to see to an end. We'll try and connect with her right after this.
Media, a global voice for unity.
Being Muslim in America, I mean, that's basically, we're criminalized just by being Muslim in some instances. So anyway, he came to me saying that, had you heard about Fuad? I said, what? He says he was picked up, he was detained. And so I reached out to one of the United States senators and got no response. And then we started examining the facts. Let's first identify what are the facts before we go out and start blowing the whistle, on this case. And so anyway, we found out the facts. And so we started to organize and started to reach out to key stakeholders like yourself, and others around the country to mobilize and put some pressure on the government to, first of all, hear his case and to release him, and allow his asylum proceedings to continue as they were. The whole idea of him getting picked up was government's response to the Israeli attacks on Iran. And so when that happened a few months ago, a number of Iranians, or people that had Iranian citizenship, got picked up, and Fawad was one of them.
Brother Wayne E. Abubakar Rawlins, president of Ummah Futures International.
Salam Media, a global voice for humanity. Connect and stay ahead with Salam Media. This is Salam Media. coming to you live from South Africa.
Verena is a place whereby we have a lot of victims of kids who are involved in the drugs. There is a lot of kids here who are roaming in the street without being taken care. We got a lot of cases of rape and the kids missing in this area. So it touched my heart that actually I need to do something about it and help those children and try to put them together in one place that when they come from school, they mustn't roam around, inshallah. They must just go to the madrasa and study there, inshallah, and then they will be protected from the drugs. And alhamdulillah is helping in a community because now when they come from school, they are no longer going around roaming and begging. Alhamdulillah, they know that when they come from school, they come straight to the madrasa and study. And then inshallah, when they finish their study, they get their meal, alhamdulillah, and then they go home.
Sister Iman Sofia Salvador, also known as Bilqis, mashallah. She is the founder of the foundation in Madrasa.
Salam Media, a global voice for humanity. Breaking stereotypes, moving boundaries, joining hands. Salam Media. Humanity sets the agenda.
Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salailo Makwidire, and we're still in conversation with Wendy Isaack, Senior Gender Justice and International Law Fellow, and a leading voice in the global struggle for accountability. And Wendy, thank you so much for coming back. Before we lost you there, we're still talking about, the importance and the significance of the COSAS 4 case, which is now heading into trials, the first ever prosecution of apartheid as a crime, and just how significant this moment is.
Yes, absolutely. And the fact that, and this is the last point I was making, the fact that there's no jurisprudence on prosecutions, successful prosecutions for that matter, the crime of apartheid, leaves us with a particular burden as lawyers to think about if the UN system and member states are looking at a new convention to criminalize apartheid and other crimes against humanity, what does accountability look like? We don't have jurisprudence to rely on it. So we need to follow very closely the developments in the COSAS 4 case, because if there is a successful prosecution there, it sets the standard for other countries, other contexts, in other places in the world where this kind of crime will be prosecuted, okay? It sets the standard, and we've set the standard as a country in terms of how we deal with the apartheid crimes, or even with the apartheid system. We transitioned from apartheid peacefully. Even with the shortcomings of the TRC, it was nevertheless a smooth political transition. Let's accept that and be grateful for it. But what we now have to do is we have to continue with this level of responsibility to say, now there's the COSAS 4 case, and there are others, right? There's the Credo 4 case that's going to come up. There are others, and there's the Campepe Commission we have to follow very closely. Now, let's take our work again and contribute to the development of international law in a way that will make sense for generations to come down the line, for generations to benefit from our own work and the struggle against apartheid in this country.
Most definitely. And speaking of, future generations, I want to take it back to, Palestine. Your op-ed argues that Israel has enforced an apartheid regime since 1948, as you mentioned, and has sustained it through, legal fragmentation, the land expropriations that you've also alluded to, movement restrictions, something that us here in South Africa know all too well, and also the demographic engineering. And more recently, the genocide that we've seen in Gaza. Number one, why has the international system failed to call this what it is? And secondly, how do the new Israeli laws passed since October the 7th in 2023 deepen the apartheid architecture that we're seeing unfold today?
Right. So let's start with how the international legal system has failed. I mean, look, I don't think the system itself has failed. I think there's been failure of implementation of decisions or findings or recommendations that have come out from international bodies on the situation in Palestine, right? So on the one hand, you take, for instance, Obviously, the genocide case is still ongoing, but at the same time, you have movements. So there's progress to some level at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, but at the same time, you have member states and the P5 at the UN Security Council in New York blocking at almost every instance any possibility for accountability or implementation of what may emerge from the ICJ on the genocide case. But let me be even more precise. The other decision, and not as much attention is paid to this advisory opinion that was issued by the International Court of Justice in July 2024. The court looked at or asked this question: to what extent is the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory since 1967 now illegal? Okay, and should it be declared illegal and unlawful, right? And the court came to the conclusion that it is. And it also came to the conclusion that there are apartheid human rights violations in that context. Now, the court limited itself to territory occupied since 1967. In other words, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the entire West Bank. And that's fine. Right now, I'm getting to the second question that you've asked, which is what has happened with these laws? To be able to even get to answer that question, let's look at the nation-state law that was passed in 2018. This is a law that the Israeli authorities or the Israeli government adopted in 2018, which essentially, and commentators and legal analysts in that context argue that this is the deepest entrenchment of an apartheid system in that country. Okay? It basically sets out the extent to which there is supremacy, Jewish supremacy over Palestinian citizens. They're not considered nationals of the state of Israel, they're considered citizens. They have less legal protection, even in terms of regular rights of protest, of disagreeing with government authorities, of allocation of resources. If you go to, let me give you a practical example, and we talk about Gaza and the West Bank quite a bit, right? Let's go into a city inside Israel, the city of Haifa. And how that city is organized. If you think of how the spatial apartheid and racial segregation and how communities are segregated in the South African context, try to imagine exactly that same system applied inside the state of Israel, where there are Palestinian communities who receive very limited resources. And I'm talking about access to water, access to electricity, and whose homes are routinely demolished because they're considered to not be allowed to build on that land. This is inside this territory of Israel. If you look at how the laws have been strengthened since October 2023, and more entrenched in a harsher way to repress and oppress the people. Talk about freedom of expression and freedom of protest, right? There've been several items of legislation. I'm going to recommend that we all take a look at a database that Adala has put together, which looks at reunification of families laws. The ability for people or Palestinians living in the different parts of the territory to marry and live with each other as members of families. That very basic attack on the fundamental right to be a family as persons who are part of the same nation is a gross violation of human rights, right? So a Palestinian who's a citizen of Israel inside the city of Nazareth is not able to live with a Palestinian coming from the city of Bethlehem in the West Bank because why? They carry different IDs. The West Bank Palestinian cannot enter the state of Israel unless they have a particular ID and particular permission. It's like literally not being able to travel or to enter from KZN Durban to drive to Johannesburg. You are not
Bantustans, similar concepts to when the Bantustans were created in apartheid South Africa.
The only difference, 100%. The only difference is with Bantustans, they weren't sure. We had security forces, we had the police, we had mass arrests. In that country, there are military checkpoints where your ID is checked by soldiers every single day. And then there is a wall that separates people. And then, if you think that is troublesome, there are obviously settlements inside the West Bank, and there are roads that are designated only for Jewish settlers to use. So try to imagine, I live in Killarney, and I'm a Palestinian, and there's a settlement in Rosebank. Oxford Road, which is literally cutting across here, is only for the use of Jewish settlers, and Palestinians cannot use that road.
Wow.
So the details of the laws requires a much longer conversation. But the ultimate point here is this. There's been quite a number of recommendations, condemnations that have come from the UN system, from international treaty bodies, from commissions of inquiry. I mean, right now, we have the commission of inquiry that Navi Pillay has been part of, and they've issued a brilliant report. After every military intervention into Gaza, there was a commission of inquiry established. The other South African who was part of one of the first commissions of inquiry was former Justice Richard Goldstone, who came out with the report and then retracted his findings. So the point is this, and then there's the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, right now, who has called everything exactly as it is. The genocide, the apartheid, the illegality of the occupation. And then she's even asked us, even as South Africans, even as global South governments, or global South states, to say, how are we in our own countries and our own governments complicit in the continuation of the Israeli occupation and apartheid and genocide? And I want to zone in on this point. And this gets to the significance of why we need to participate as South Africans, government and civil society, in the formulation of this draft treaty. Because we need to be mindful of how international law develops contrary to things that sometimes can develop contrary to things that we want, number one, but also we have a responsibility. We've been to the ICJ for genocide. We went to the ICJ for the advisory opinion. The court handed down a decision. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights handed down 3 resolutions to say governments must not be complicit. No complicity. That means we need to get behind a definition of apartheid in the new treaty that will make sure that Palestinians are covered and protected by the definition of apartheid, because we cannot run the risk of lack of accountability for 70 years of apartheid by the Israeli regime.
Well, they have it, Wendy Isaac. I wish we had more time to, unpack other elements of your op-ed, but I think we'll look for time. It's been really, really interesting. It's been very, very eye-opening. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
There you go. Wendy Isaac, Senior Justice and International Law Fellow there, joining us for, I think, a very, very eye-opening discussion on International Human Rights Day and why there needs to be a nudge, an urge to act on apartheid crimes, not just here in South Africa where everything's been left hanging, essentially. Imagine 30 years since democracy, only now the first persecution for apartheid-era crimes will be heading to the court. The Cosas 4 case, if you don't know about it, just for context, the Cosas 4 case refers to the 1982 murders of 4 young anti-apartheid activists, Eustace Madikela, Peter Matabane, Fanyana Nhlapo, Zandisile Musi, from the Congress of South African Students, Cosas, and they were murdered essentially by the apartheid security forces, lured into a pump house, and that was rigged with explosives, and they were killed. And you would think there would have been more cases after the TRC, but nothing. This is the first ever persecution of apartheid as a crime. It's a very, very significant moment, and I think it can be used as a moment to set precedents, because that's what law requires, to set precedents, to say, well, there were other similar cases, and because of this one, there could be other persecutions. So I think really, really wonderful insights there from Wendy, and also the parallels between apartheid South Africa and apartheid Israel, and the victimization, continued victimization of Palestinians. It was really, really eye-opening. I hope and I pray I'll talk to my producer to, I don't know, we'll find time before the year end to have her back on air, because there's so many other elements, from that discussion that we could have looked at. And one that I want to discuss again was the gender aspect of it, and how there needs to be a reconfiguration of the definition of apartheid. Wendy and some of our colleagues are proposing that there should be an expanded definition that includes both race and gender, and why, the gender component of apartheid victimhood is also so critical. So I think there's so much more to discuss on that aspect. But unfortunately, as always, there's never enough time. And we've come to the end of today's edition of News and Views. Thank you so much for joining us and being part of the show for the past 2 hours and 22 minutes. I'll be back with you again next week, Monday, for another edition of the show. Otherwise, it's goodbye for now. Shap, shap.